Trouble River by Betsy Byers, Chapter 6, An Unexpected Stop. The morning seemed endless. It was like the long, dusty days coming west in the wagon when there had been nothing to see but more ground and more sky, and nothing to do but keep moving. Dewey had the feeling then when the wagon train was standing still despite the wheels that kept turning, and now he had the same feeling about the raft. They were moving, but he had only to look at the banks and the water eddying around them to see that. But at times the raft seemed suspended in the river. The chill from the night was gone, and the sun found them between the high banks of the river. They passed ash trees and cottonwoods, but got only momentary relief in the patches of shade. Soon Grandma was fanning herself with the hem of her skirt. "Hot," she said. "Grandma, don't this remind you of coming out west in the wagon? The creaking and jerking's the same, but we ain't as dusty," she said. Then she sighed. "Ain't we ever going to stop and eat, boy? I'm wanting to get off and stretch my legs. I'm looking for a place." The banks along the stretch of the river would be difficult for him to climb, impossible for Grandma. At last they rounded a bend. He saw the perfect spot, a grassy bank that jutted out into the water with a small tree that would help to give support to her unsteady step. His teeth clenched with the effort of turning the raft. The currents were strong, pulling the oar in the wrong direction. "Why don't we stop yonder, boy?" his grandma said. She indicated with her cane the same place he had chosen. The raft was agonizingly slow in changing direction, and when it finally did turn toward the point, it was too late. The edge of the raft struck the rock at the tip of the point, and this caused it to turn slowly around in the water. On the shore, a small antelope watched them, its slender neck bent forward, its dark eyes curious, but not afraid. "What'd you do that for?" his grandma snapped. "I thought we were going to stop there." "No, not there." "Well, when are we going to stop?" "On down the river, I reckon." "Well, let's stop this infernal turning." She was now facing the direction they had just come from. "I like to see where I'm going, not where I've been." "Yes'm." He plunged his oar into the water almost fiercely. "There," he said. "And remember, I'm wanting to stop. Hear me, boy?" "Yes." "Move the raft out of this here current, and you won't have no trouble stopping. That's what I do." They continued down the river. Grandma began to slap one hand impatiently against the arm of her rocker. This continuous sound began to irritate Dewey, and when Charlie, who was restless too, began to whimper, he said, "Charlie, hush up, Charlie." "The dog," Grandma said slowly, still tapping her hands against the chair, "wants to get off this here raft." Now they went through a long stretch of rocky shore with trees lining the river. His grandma could no more climb the rocks than the steep bank, he thought. On a distant hill, through the trees, he could see a long line of buffalo moving in Indian file. They stepped slowly, shaggy heads down in the deep, rank grass. "Yonder's buffalo," he said. His grandma did not even turn her head, but continued to slap her hands against the arm of the chair. He watched the buffalo seem to sink one by one into the earth. "You missed them. They must have gone down into a ravine." She only slapped harder. "Will you hush up?" he said tightly. She glanced at him, and then he added quickly, "Charlie," even though the dog was now quiet, as if he had given up all hope. Ahead there was a bend in the river, and a long, low mud bank stretched out like a hand, pointing to the opposite shore. It was so low in the water that Dewey did not see it at first. "You see that bank, don't you, boy?" Now he saw it. "Yes'm. We'll steer on around it." "Yes'm." He put the oar into the water and paddled quickly. The raft was slightly turning to the right, and it had gained speed in the long stretch of water, and Dewey could see at once that the raft was not going to clear the bank. They drew closer, and Dewey knew that they were going to hit. Rushing forward, bracing one foot onto the low split log, he reached out with the oar to break the impact. Grandma sat forward in her chair to watch the boys' skillful maneuver that would send them around the bank and on down the river. The oar jammed into the soft mud, and then to the other end punched hard into Dewey's chest, knocking him backwards. Grandma, who was already leaning forward, was almost thrown out of her chair. She straightened quickly and looked at Dewey from beneath her bonnet, her brows drawn close in annoyance. She stretched her neck up, and she looked exactly like an eagle he had once seen. "What did you do that for?" she asked testily. He put one hand to his chest. He expected to find an imprint of the oar in his bones, and he breathed carefully. Nothing was broken. He sighed with relief. "What are we going to do here?" she asked. "This is where we're going to stop," he said, setting down the oar beside him. "Stop here?" She indicated the mud bank with her cane. "What are we stopping here for?" Charlie, happy to have stopped it all, limped from the raft and then onto the mud bank to land, leaving a trail of staggered footsteps behind him. "Now look at that," Grandma exclaimed. "The mud's soft. We can't walk on that." Without a word, Dewey secured the raft, took up the bundle, and slung it over his shoulder. "More than likely it's quicksand," she warned. "Folks sink in quicksand, and I ain't never seen again." He hesitated. "Charlie didn't sink. The dog didn't weigh enough. You and me do." Dewey moved to the edge of the raft and put his foot on the bank. "If you sink, don't be hollering at me to save you." As he stepped onto the bank, he felt his foot begin to settle in the mud, and for a moment he thought it was quicksand. Then, with a sucking noise, his foot came free, and he began to move quickly to shore. Grandma looked at his footprints, now filling with water. "I ain't wanting to sink in no quicksand." "Me either," Dewey said. "I'll be back to help you in a minute." When he returned, he was relieved to see that Grandma had risen from her chair and was preparing to step onto the mud. He took her arm, and the two of them slowly, noisily made their way to land. "Oh, it is good to have some ground under me," she said as they stepped ashore. "I spread the blanket over there." "Well, it ain't as bad as I thought. I ain't never see this nice little spot here under the tree." He considered briefly, saying he had seen it and that was why he had decided to stop the raft, but the dull pain in his chest stopped him. Wearily they sat on the blanket and looked over the supplies. The food, which had seemed ample to Dewey when he was piling it into the blanket, now looked sparse and uninviting. There were a dozen or so raw potatoes, 1 tin cup, a jug of molasses, loose berries, a small pail that the berries had been in, 2 slabs of fried meat which had stained the blanket with grease, several cakes of cornmeal which had now crumbled. "If you hadn't let the dog wallow all over the food." She looked carefully over the possibilities. "I couldn't help it. He just got on it when I wasn't looking." "He gets on everything," she grumbled, "and is in everything. Well, hand me one of them cornmeal cakes and get me some water in the cup, boy." "Yes'm." She took the cup of water he brought her and looked at it carefully for a moment as to see if anything was stirring. Dewey ate a cornmeal cake slowly and watched her, knowing she was weighing her thirst against the danger of a cup of water from Trouble River. Then, wordlessly, she poured molasses from the jug into the water and looked at him. "You ain't eating without blessing your food, are you, boy?" He bowed his head quickly, aware of the dry cornmeal cake that filled his mouth. "Lord," she began, "you see us out here in this wilderness. We are lost, but we ain't scared, Lord, because we know you take special care of anybody or anything that's lost. We thank you for this food, and we ask you make us strong. Amen." She looked up. "Now you could swallow, boy." He nodded. Rising quickly, he ran to the river, scooped a handful of water, and drank. Then he filled the pail and came back drinking from it. He ate without stopping, for he was hungry, and then he lay full on the blanket on his stomach. "What if Pa comes and finds us gone?" he said slowly. "It ain't likely." She continued to sip the molasses and water, wishing it was her hot potato coffee. "It's 2 days to Hunter City by wagon and 2 days back, and your ma'll want to rest up before she starts home with the baby. It ain't likely." "Well, if there's trouble with the Indians, they'll hear about it, won't they?" "Maybe," she said, and she looked at him. "Only sometimes Indian trouble don't give any more warning than a snake. I've seen a man get bit by a copperhead one time. He was loading stones to make a fireplace, and a copperhead caught him right on the wrist, and there wasn't no sound of warning." "But wouldn't people see the Indians coming? Wouldn't there be? If there was 50 Indians, somebody might see them. Or if there was 100. Only Indian trouble ain't like that anymore. Maybe there's a handful of Indians, renegades, more likely than not, and they can be moved so quiet and quick you won't see them until you were looking at them." She emptied the contents of her cup and looked with distaste at the silt that was left at the bottom. "You heard about the trouble at Gibbons Creek some years back?" "Yes'm. Jimmy Sayers told me about it." "And did Jimmy Sayers tell you how many Indians done all the killing?" "No, 12. 1 dozen. "But didn't the settlers have guns? Couldn't they have shot the Indians?" "You can't shoot what you can't see, boy. Them Indians come up at night, set fire to the cabins one by one, and when the folks come out running, the Indians shot them." She shook the cup at him. "If you hadn't seen that Indians, likely the same thing would have happened to us. He knowed there wasn't but a boy and an old woman in that cabin." "Oh." She set her cup into her lap and looked up at the sky. Dewey closed his eyes, and the warmth of the sun made him drowsy. He heard his grandma unclasp the velour satchel containing all her valuables. She took out her marriage paper, old and faded, and set it aside. She took out a small blue bowl that she said was the very color of the hills back home. Then she reached into the bottom of the satchel and withdrew a small cloth bag. It was her button bag. Dewey had not seen it for years. She untied the cord and emptied it into her lap. The shower of buttons, glass, Gilt, mother of pearl, heavy work buttons, round jet beads. Dewey fell asleep watching his grandma looked at one button after another. He felt as if he had been sleeping for only a moment when she shook his shoulder and shook him. We better get going, boy. Yes'm. He sat up and looked at the remaining food. He retied the blanket over the now pitifully small supplies, shouldered it, and lifted the gun to his shoulder. His back and side muscles ached, and he noticed there were blisters on his hands. He was feeling the strain of hours on the raft, but he was glad his grandma did not know this. Still holding the blanket and the gun, he paused to look over the prairie. There was a haze on the horizon to the east, and he thought it might be smoke. Their cabin was in that direction. "Grandma," he said. She looked at him. "What is it?" His eyes, squinting toward the horizon, lowered suddenly. He had heard the anxiety in his grandma's voice, and he knew without looking at her that her face would be pinched with worry. "Oh, nothing. Let's go." "Is there anything wrong, boy? You ain't seen no Indians or nothing." Her eyes were weak, and she took his arm tightly in her thin fingers. "No." "Well, what was you? I thought I saw something, but I probably didn't. Come on." She paused only a moment, then lifted her head quickly, the way an old mare does in the spring, and followed him, holding tightly to his shoulder.